if you're an endurance athlete and you've Googled endurance training at all, the term threshold comes up. Well, what does threshold really mean? An article in Outside Magazine recently had that question. What does your threshold really mean? And I guess over this past summer, a scientist at UCLA, Carl Wasserman, passed away at the age of 93. And of course, most of us wouldn't have heard of him, but he had done some interesting studies on threshold training, and he's the guy who was credited with coming up with the idea of anaerobic threshold back in the 1950s. The concept originally seemed straightforward, but in the half century since has turned out to be endlessly controversial and confusing. And basically it talks about that the Journal of Physiology recently published a massive new overview of the tangled history called Anaerobic Threshold, 50 Years Plus of Controversy by 4 prominent research in the field. And basically what they said was anaerobic threshold does not represent the point at which you're exercising so hard that your muscles can no longer get enough oxygen. What, if anything, it does represent is the topic of the other 73 pages in the thing. So we're going to kind of cut to the chase. And we're going to get my Mr. Moo to quit barking at whoever just rang our doorbell. So as you can tell, my threshold for Mr. Moo's barking is very low. He's 14, 15 years old. I think he's going to be 15 years old soon. That's some 100 years old to you and me. But he's been barking at things forever. He's never caught anything, of course. So stripped down, the essence, the basic concept is you can divide exercise into 2 distinct zones. And I talk about this often, easy and hard. And that's kind of why I always say, be boring, not epic. And that most people, when they get things wrong, is they go too hard too often, but they don't go hard enough. And so, your easy days should be really, really easy. Your hard days should be really, really hard. So basically black or white, or I prefer almost red or blue. Hey, I'm in the United States, of course, why not red or blue? So you don't want purple. You want a deep red, you want a deep blue, easy, hard. And so it's an easy thing to talk about. So since the 1930s, they've been talking about a critical metabolic level known at the time as the Owl's point. Below that point, you could exercise without accumulating any lactic acid in your blood. Above that point, you see a steady rise in lactic acid, which at the time was believed to cause muscle fatigue. And anyway, anyone who has done lots of endurance exercises intuitively felt for the transition from sustainable to unsustainable, and that's definitely the case. And so you often hear like, I built up that lactic acid, and that's the burn, and that's why I had to slow down. But there is that sweet spot, and that's kind of what they're talking about here, is that Wasserman, one of his big things was you could kind of do the breathing test instead of, pin pricks and stuff like that. Of course, high tech, we're doing the pin prick. And I'm sure probably in the future we've already got watches that are measuring our pulse with our wrist. And I'll tell you, they're very accurate. My Garmin's pretty dang accurate. So is my Fitbit that I'm always wearing, pretty accurate. And then they're also kind of now measuring your oxidation level, your pulse ox. In fact, just watch an Ever show where they're using the pulse oxes. And so he found that, you can just kind of measure breathing rate, carbon dioxide levels, oxygen levels, and the resulting oxygen shortage would force the muscles to rely on less efficient anaerobic energy sources, producing the dreaded lactic acid as a byproduct and leading to a further cascade of chemical reactions that produce extra carbon dioxide. As a result, if you carefully measure how much oxygen a subject breathe in, how much carbon dioxide they breathe out, sudden change in that ratio will reveal when they cross that anaerobic threshold. And of course, anaerobic means without oxygen. Now, Wasserman's ideas were very influential, but our understanding of what's going on has happened to change. We don't actually have lactic acid circulating in our blood. And when I read this, I was like, wow, I've been kind of always told that, and you hear about that. In fact, Lance Armstrong was talking about how they would do the lactic acid test and how he could judge his fitness by that. I don't know, he's using drugs too. But they're also talking about how some athletes have an incredible ability to compete with a really high lactic acid level in their bodies, and other people collapse. And then one of the things they were talking about, which I'd love to see more research, was Michael Phelps was talking. They're talking about that Michael Phelps doesn't even create lactic. So that was very interesting, that it's so low, like it'll be the same when he starts the race as he finishes it, which would kind of make sense. And so it says, that it's not actually circulating in our blood. What's circulating in our blood is a related molecule called lactate, and lactate is a dead-end waste product of anaerobic metabolism. It's hugely useful molecule that serves as an extra fuel source in the muscles and other parts of the body, and is a signaling molecule that helps tell the body to adapt and get fitter. And most importantly, lactate isn't produced because your muscles can't get enough oxygen. And this forever, I've never really heard this. That's one of the reasons I kind of was going over this. You always just hear, oh, you got lactic acid in your blood, and that's kind of why people take the ice baths, and God, now people want to take ice baths every damn day, which isn't really what it's for. But the lactate actually is just a fuel source. So I was very interested to read that in this article. So it's not lactic acids in your bloodstream, it's lactate. And what is interesting, the next part of this says the levels of lactate you measure in your blood don't just reflect how much lactate your muscles are producing, as noted above. Lactate is also a valuable fuel, so you're using up some of the lactate you generate. This kind of explains Michael Phelps' phenomena. What you measure in the blood is the difference between lactate production and lactate reuse. One of the big adaptations that comes with endurance training is the ability to reuse large amounts of lactate, which means that even if you're using some anaerobic energy and producing lactate, you can still settle into a sustainable metabolic state if you're able to use the lactate as fast as you produce it. And so that kind of explains a lot when they were talking, Lance was talking to the swimmer and talking about how he gets out of the pool and they measured and it's at some level and then it goes down eventually. But then when you were measuring other athletes, it was not even showing up. So this new idea, elevated by stable levels of lactate, muddies the waters because it means that there are really two different thresholds. The first is the intensity at which lactate begins increasing above its resting levels. If you exercise just above this threshold, you elevate but stable levels of lactate. The second is the intensity at which your lactate levels are no longer stable. Exercise above this intensity and your lactate levels will increase steadily until you reach exhaustion. And that kind of makes sense. So in the article, there's a nice little graph showing the different thresholds and different lactate levels and whatnot. And they talk about that there's almost 25 different thresholds, but the lowest one, or the lower ones, basically he calls the lactate threshold. And that's kind of when you go from just resting to starting to produce lactate. And then the next one is basically when you hit that balance where you're going, where you're building up lactate and the body's not going to be a sustainable level and it becomes unstable. And so basically what it is that second threshold is trickier to pin down. And so what you really need to do, instead of that's the crossing point, is figure out what the critical speed is. And it's kind of now makes more sense, like I was just thinking about this, that the threshold is kind of the threshold at where you're on that balancing point where you can maintain this pace and not, as long as you're like on a knife's edge, but you're okay. Go a little bit too hard, go a little bit too fast, you'll definitely have problems. And he basically talks about that in the next thing. He says that it's basically critical speed. And it's in brief, if you take 3 all-out performances at different distances and plot them on a graph, you can calculate a theoretical speed at which you should be able to run forever. You can't really run forever, however, other sources of fatigue intervene. But that theoretical speed is your critical speed, and it marks the dividing line between what's metabolically sustainable and unsustainable in terms of the mix of anaerobic and aerobic energy burned in the lactate. And so that's the threshold. And I often talk to athletes, it doesn't matter what distance. When I was coaching high school, from the mile to 6 days, we often talk that, just a few seconds in the beginning become minutes in the end, So, if you're trying to, say, run a 3-hour marathon at 6:52 pace, do you want to run the first 15 miles at 6:20 pace or even 6:40 pace? No, because those seconds that you rob at the beginning will build up because you're going over that. You're not in a sustainable zone. So you want to be right training you got to look at your training and train so that you can be right at that 6:52. You don't want to go 6:40 for the 15 miles and then try and hang on, because then all of a sudden, instead of doing 6:50s, you'll be doing 7:10, 7:20, 8 minutes, and then completely crash and burn. And I see this, like I said, in every race from the mile to the 6 day. You often see it, like in a mile race, or you'll see the young freshmen go out hard the first quarter mile, second quarter falls back, and third and fourth are just disastrous. And that's kind of why you see most races have negative splits, where they do the second half faster than the first half. So you're trying to stay under that threshold definitely for the first part of the race, and then get right on the threshold and dance on that. And that is the place where, in theory, you could go on for quite some time. And I've been talking and working with some friends of mine who have big goals in 6 day races. And I keep trying to tell them that they can't go and do, say you want to do 400 miles in a 6 day. You need to do 67 miles a day. But you can't go out and do 75 on day one, because you're just pushing too hard, too fast, and you're going to pay the price, even though it's days in advance. My good friend Yolanda Holder, who's gone over 400 many, many times walking the entire way, She's phenomenal. On day one, she goes out and does 67 miles, finishes up in 17, 18 hours, and then takes a break till the following morning until the next 24, goes out and does it again, goes out and does it again. And then maybe on the final day, she does a big long push to make sure she gets the 400 or breaks one of her many records she has set. So that's kind of where you've got to figure out. And what I really like about taking the 2 or 3 different races all out is that's kind of the whole idea behind Jack Daniel's VDOT. And you can put that in. I've been using that thing for years since I found it back in 2006, 2007, and now there's a nice little calculator, and use that VDOT, and it will take a 5K time and predict what you could do a half in, or a 10K in, or a marathon in. And I really like that, and it's basically the same concept. Use these marks and use a graph and figure out what pace you can maintain for that distance, and then it also gives you some handy training paces. And he of course has marathon pace, threshold pace, easy pace, and whatnot. So the takeaway with all this is Wasserman's anaerobic threshold was the wrong name. It has nothing to do with the lack of oxygen for the wrong threshold. It's critical speed, not lactate threshold, that makes fundamental divide between sustainable and unsustainable. But it's produced a lot of good science. The review authors quote Francis Bacon's line: "The truth emerges more readily from the error than from confusion." So lactate threshold is more accessible. It still has plenty of predictive values for things like figuring out who is healthy enough to survive major surgery. So, studying some of this sports medicine stuff has implications, and especially during this COVID, it's kind of good to look at that and see the lactate threshold, when people are having issues with COVID and breathing. And I know, like with the Everest stuff, with the pulse, the pulse oxygen level meters, and they're testing guys up at Everest and thinking, wow, their pulse ox is 75%, how are they alive? And they can use that science to help with other people, sick people and whatnot. So sports medicine isn't always just helping people run faster and win races. Now, of course, I'm talking about endurance, especially running, and so it's has practical purposes, and that critical speed seems to be a better way of predicting marathon pace, as a recent data dump from Nike's Breaking 2 project showed, and says great marathons have 2 thresholds close together. You accumulate no lactate at all until they're very close to their critical speed. Middle distance runners, however, tend to have a wide gap between thresholds. They start generating lactate at comparatively low intensities, but it doesn't start shooting out of control until a much higher intensity. And that might show why some guys are great 10K half marathoners, but just never seem to be able to put together a decent marathon. And then lastly, the author of the article says, the threshold concept I still find most useful is the talk test. It gives you 3 exercise zones: talking in full sentences, talking in short phrases, and talking in single words, usually explicitives. And that's definitely the case what I do my training and often with my coaching. I'm like, okay, today's workout, you should have a full conversation. Then maybe you're doing a threshold run, you can talk in short sentences, and then of course we're doing some really fast, intense stuff. You're just being able to yes, no, or worse. So basically, that's how threshold is, and it's kind of I'm glad I read this article, and they finished off the article saying, but one thing hasn't changed. If you're an endurance athlete, you better be able to feel it, and what they're saying is you better be able to feel when you're crossing over from the aerobic to the anaerobic to where you're getting the lactate levels that are manageable and using them as fuel, and know that point, that critical speed of like, okay, I'm okay with this lactic level, but if I go just a little bit harder, I'm going to crash and burn. And as always, stay healthy, be boring, not epic.